The moment of uncertainty. The sky was clear, with the sun hanging low in the horizon, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The wind was mild, the world felt peaceful, and Angela couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so free. She'd just finished a long shift, but this drive was her way of unwinding. It wasn't every day she could let her guard down, not in her line of work, not in the uniform she wore. But today was different. Today, she was Angela Harris, not just Captain Harris. She thought of the miles she traveled to get to this point, the years of hard work, the late nights poring over paperwork, the time she had sacrificed with friends and family, the compromises, and the moments when she wondered if it was all worth it. But it was. Every bit of it had been worth it. Now, here she was, driving the car she dreamed about for years, a bright red sports car that reflected her hard-earned success. She had always wanted something to show for all her dedication, and this car was her symbol of perseverance. As she cruised down the scenic route, the feeling of contentment washed over her. The gentle hum of the engine beneath her was music to her ears, a melody she'd worked so hard to achieve. The occasional car passed by, and Angela could see drivers glancing at her. She didn't mind. Let them stare. They had no idea who she was or the journey it took to be where she was today. Her mind drifted as the road stretched before her, almost as if she were floating in a space where nothing could touch her. She was in control for the first time in a long time. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden flash in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought it might have been another car's headlights, reflecting off her mirrors, but then it became undeniable, the blue and red flashing lights of a police car. Her heart skipped a beat. What had happened? There was no reason for her to be pulled over. She hadn't been speeding, hadn't run any red lights, hadn't done anything out of the ordinary. Yet, the officer's siren wailed behind her, demanding her attention. Angela's first reaction was disbelief. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. What could this be about? Did they mistake her for someone else? No, that was ridiculous. She had a clean record. Everything about this car, this moment, felt wrong. She wasn't doing anything that warranted being stopped. And yet there was no denying it. The flashing lights were real. She eased the car to the side of the road, pulling into a small area just off the highway where there was a line of trees, shielding her from view. As the car came to a stop, Angela's heart pounded in her chest. Her breathing became shallow as her mind raced. The silence in the car was suffocating. What would happen next? The officer had already begun to step out of his vehicle. Angela tried to stay composed. She had been in situations before where things could get tense. The training, the experience, all of it ran through her head like a checklist. First, remain calm. Second, make sure you communicate clearly. Third, do not make any sudden movements. But this situation felt different. She was being judged, not on her actions, but on assumptions about who she was. The officer approached the car, his hands resting on his belt, eyes scanning the vehicle as though it were a potential threat. Angela took a deep breath, her back straight as she rolled down the window. "Good afternoon, officer," she said politely, her voice steady despite the nervous fluttering in her chest. "Is there a problem?" The officer didn't respond immediately. His eyes flicked over her, lingering on her skin, before darting to the car and then back to her face. He seemed almost unsure, confused. But his demeanor quickly hardened, and without a word, he barked, "Step out of the car." Angela froze for a split second. She wasn't sure what to think, but her instincts told her to remain calm. She had been in plenty of traffic stops before, but none like this. As she opened the door and stepped out of the car, she heard him speak again, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had already made up their mind. "Is this your car?" The officer's words felt like an accusation, not a simple question. Angela could sense the judgment in his tone, and it hit her like a punch to the gut. The way he said it, the way he looked at her, it wasn't about the car at all. It was about her. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, the subtle glint of suspicion creeping into his gaze. She wasn't sure whether to be angry or frustrated. How could he jump to such a conclusion without even asking for her name? Without bothering to get to know her? "Yes, officer," she replied, keeping her voice calm. "This is my car. Is there a problem?" The officer seemed to hesitate, like the response didn't fit into the narrative he had already constructed in his mind. There was something about the way he moved, his fingers twitching near his belt, that made Angela's chest tighten. This wasn't a casual interaction anymore. This was escalating, and she could feel it. "Let me see your license and registration," he demanded, his tone now sharp and dismissive. Angela's fingers trembled as she reached into her pocket for her wallet, then handed over her ID and the registration. She wasn't sure if she had ever felt more exposed in her life. Her own identity was being questioned, scrutinized, as if she didn't belong here, as if her presence was somehow an anomaly. The officer snatched the documents from her hand, barely glancing at them, almost as though he didn't care. He stared at her once more, as though trying to find some kind of hidden truth. That's when he said it. "This car is stolen." Angela's stomach churned. Stolen? How could he possibly think that? She had worked so hard for this car, for this life. Everything she had achieved, everything she had done to get here, had been dismissed with a single accusation. She wanted to scream, to shout at him, to reveal her true identity as Captain Angela Harris, a decorated officer with years of service. But the instinct to remain calm surged through her, overriding the need to defend herself in that moment. "Officer, I can assure you, this is my car," Angela said, trying to keep her voice even. But her frustration was becoming harder to mask. "Yeah, right," the officer muttered under his breath, his eyes now hard with suspicion. "I've seen people like you before. You think you can just steal a car like this and drive off without anyone noticing." Angela felt as though the ground beneath her feet was shifting. This was not a routine traffic stop. This wasn't just about a simple mistake. This was something more, something rooted in bias, in prejudice. Her mind raced, and in that moment, everything she had worked for, everything she had accomplished, seemed irrelevant. It was as if the officer saw her only for the color of her skin, and that was all that mattered. Her blood boiled. She had worked for years, decades even, to prove herself, to fight against every unfair assumption, and to break down the barriers of discrimination. And yet, here she was, treated like a criminal. The sting of injustice burned deep, but Angela knew she had to stay composed. The situation was already tense, and she couldn't afford to escalate it any further. Despite the anger swirling inside her, she took a deep breath. She would not let him break her. She would not let him strip away her dignity. But she couldn't shake the thought that this was just the beginning. Whatever happened next, Angela Harris was about to find out just how far the biases of those in power could go. The humiliation. Angela stood by the roadside, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. The world around her seemed to slow down as her mind struggled to process the officer's audacity. She had been in countless intense situations before. Drug busts, violent altercations, high-stakes arrests. But none of them compared to this moment. This was different. This wasn't about the law, about justice, or about keeping the streets safe. This was about power. And right now, Officer Trent Walker was abusing it. She had given him everything he had asked for. Her license, her registration, her patience. But none of it mattered. His mind was already made up. In his eyes, she was guilty. Not because of any crime, but because of the way she looked. And that fact alone burned through her like fire. A small crowd had begun to gather, some standing at a cautious distance, while others took out their phones to record. She could hear hushed whispers, see curious glances, and she knew exactly what they were thinking. Another unjust traffic stop. Another black person being humiliated by the very people who had sworn to protect them. Walker held her documents in his hands, barely glancing at them, his face twisted in skepticism. "This car has to be stolen," he muttered, shaking his head as if the mere idea of her legally owning a luxury vehicle was too absurd to believe. Angela exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. "Officer, I have complied with everything you asked. My registration and license are valid. If you take a moment to run my information, you'll see that there's absolutely no reason to believe this vehicle is stolen." Walker scoffed. "I don't need to run anything. I've seen enough." Her heart pounded in her chest. He wasn't even pretending to follow procedure. He wasn't interested in the truth. He was looking for a reason, any reason, to justify the narrative he had already built in his head. Angela squared her shoulders, standing tall despite the sinking feeling in her stomach. "Officer, I am asking you one more time to verify my information before making any further accusations. If you refuse, I will be forced to take action." Walker let out a short, mocking laugh. "Take action? And what exactly are you gonna do?" His voice dripped with condescension. Angela opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Walker reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I've got a possible Grand Theft Auto suspect here. Need backup," he said into his shoulder radio, his voice loud enough for the bystanders to hear. Angela's breath hitched. This was bad. Really bad. Possible Grand Theft Auto suspect. That one sentence was all it took. The moment he said those words, he had set the wheels in motion. Soon, more officers would arrive, guns at the ready, looking at her not as a person, not as a fellow officer, but as a suspect, a criminal. The tension in the air thickened. A woman in the crowd gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. A young man, probably in his 20s, shook his head, muttering, "This ain't right." Angela turned back to Walker, her voice firm. "Officer, I am Captain Angela Harris of the City Police Department. I urge you to—" "Yeah, right," Walker interrupted with a smirk. "And I'm the commissioner." Angela's nails dug into the palms of her hands. Her badge was in her bag inside the car, but she knew that even if she pulled it out, Walker wouldn't believe her. His prejudice had already blinded him to reason. And then, before she could utter another word, Walker did something she would never forget. He grabbed her by the wrist and twisted her arm behind her back. Angela let out a sharp breath as a bolt of pain shot up her shoulder. Her body tensed. She could have resisted, easily broken out of his grip. She had been trained for worse, but she knew that any sudden movement would be used against her. "You're under arrest for Grand Theft Auto," Walker declared, his grip tightening. Gasps erupted from the crowd. "Are you serious?" someone yelled. She didn't even resist. Another voice called out. Angela stood frozen, her jaw clenched as Walker pulled out a pair of handcuffs and snapped them around her wrists. The cold metal bit into her skin, sending a wave of humiliation through her. It wasn't just about the arrest. It was about the message. This was about power. This was about putting her in her place. Her dignity was being stripped away in front of an audience, her authority, her identity, reduced to nothing in Walker's eyes. Angela inhaled sharply, closing her eyes for a moment. Focus. Think. Her training screamed at her to stay calm, to let the situation play out. But the weight of what was happening pressed down on her, suffocating her like a heavy blanket. Walker shoved her forward slightly, forcing her to walk toward his cruiser. "You're making a big mistake," she said, her voice low but firm. "No, lady," he sneered. "The only mistake was you thinking you could get away with this." Angela bit down on her lip so hard she tasted copper. Walker opened the door to the back of his squad car, but before he could push her inside, another police vehicle sped onto the scene, tires screeching as it came to a halt. Angela turned her head, her pulse spiking. Two officers stepped out of the car, one of them instantly recognizable, Sergeant Jason Williams. As soon as Williams saw Angela, his face paled. "Trent," Williams said sharply, his voice full of alarm. "What the hell are you doing?" Walker frowned, clearly annoyed. "What does it look like?" "I caught a car thief." "Uncuff her." "Now," Williams commanded, cutting him off. Walker's expression twisted in confusion. "Wait, what? No, you don't understand. She's Captain Harris," Williams snapped, his voice laced with authority. "You just arrested your superior officer." A heavy silence fell over the scene. Walker blinked, his face draining of color. "No, that's not possible," he stammered. "It's more than possible," Williams said, stepping closer. "It's reality. And you just made the biggest mistake of your damn career." Angela exhaled slowly as Walker's hands trembled. His arrogance was crumbling. She could see it in his eyes. The slow, dawning realization of what he had done. Walker's hands fumbled as he hurried to unlock the cuffs. The moment Angela felt the weight of the restraints disappear, she flexed her fingers, inhaling deeply, trying to push down the storm of emotions brewing inside her. She turned to face Walker, her gaze piercing. "You racially profiled me," she said, her voice cold but controlled. "You humiliated me. You falsely arrested me." Walker opened his mouth, but no words came out. Angela leaned in slightly. "And this will not go unaddressed." The shame on Walker's face was almost satisfying. Almost. But nothing could erase the sting of what had just happened. Angela had spent years proving herself in this system. She had climbed the ranks, fought against bias, and dedicated her life to justice. And yet, in a single moment, all of that had been stripped away by a man who refused to see her as anything more than the color of her skin. Angela had always believed in justice, but now she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly. And she was just getting started. The power of standing your ground. The sharp metallic clink of the handcuffs unlocking echoed in the air, but it did nothing to erase the damage that had been done. Angela flexed her wrists, rubbing the raw skin where the metal had pressed into her flesh. Every nerve in her body burned with a mixture of humiliation and fury. She had faced danger before, life-threatening situations on duty, high-stakes arrests where hesitation meant death. But nothing compared to the sting of what had just happened. Walker still stood frozen, his face drained of color, his hands awkwardly hovering in the air, as if unsure what to do next. The weight of his mistake was pressing down on him like a collapsing building. Angela straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to breathe, to control the fire raging inside her. She was Captain Angela Harris, not just another woman targeted by a reckless officer's bias. She had power, authority, and respect. But for the past 10 minutes, none of that had mattered. All he had seen was a black woman behind the wheel of a luxury car, and that had been enough for him to strip her of her dignity. Sergeant Williams' voice cut through the tension. "Trent, you need to explain yourself. Right now." His voice was sharp, commanding, barely controlled. Walker swallowed hard, his confidence visibly crumbling. I thought. I had reason to believe the car was stolen." Williams' jaw clenched. "Did you check the registration?" I didn't get a chance to verify before." "You had the documents in your hand," Williams snapped, stepping forward. His voice rose with every word, the tension thick enough to strangle the air around them. "Did you even look at them, Walker?" Walker flinched slightly. I saw the car and, well, it was suspicious." Angela's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Suspicious." Her voice was icy. "And what exactly made it suspicious, Officer Walker?" Walker hesitated. Angela stepped closer, closing the gap between them. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for every person who had ever been wrongly accused. Every individual who had been judged not by their actions, but by assumptions. Was it the model of the car? The color? Or was it the fact that someone who looks like me doesn't fit into the picture you have in your head of a legal car owner? Walker's mouth opened, but no words came out. "I gave you my license, my registration, everything you needed to confirm that I am the rightful owner of this car," Angela continued. "But that wasn't enough, was it? Because in your eyes, a black woman driving a luxury car must have stolen it. Walker's gaze dropped to the ground. Angela inhaled deeply, then turned to the crowd, her eyes sweeping over the faces watching the scene unfold. The bystanders, many of whom had been recording the incident from the start, stared at her with a mixture of admiration and anger. Some shook their heads, others whispered to one another. The entire moment had been captured. And now, there was proof. Proof of the kind of racial profiling so many had experienced, but had never been able to fully expose. One woman, an older lady standing near the front of the crowd, stepped forward slightly. Her voice was soft but firm. "Ma'am, do you want us to keep filming?" Angela nodded. "Yes, don't stop recording. The truth needs to be seen." Walker shifted uncomfortably, finally realizing just how badly he had messed up. There was no escaping the consequences now. The truth was out in the open. Angela took a deep breath before looking back at Williams. "I want him reported," she said firmly. "Immediately." Williams nodded. "It's already being handled, Captain." But Angela wasn't done. She turned back to Walker. "You owe me an apology." The silence was deafening. Walker's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. He was struggling, whether out of genuine guilt or sheer embarrassment. Angela couldn't tell. But she wouldn't let him off the hook that easily. "Say it," she said, her tone firm. Walker hesitated for a moment longer before finally forcing out the words. I was wrong." His voice was stiff, void of the confidence and arrogance he had displayed earlier. I'm sorry, Captain Harris." Angela let the words hang in the air for a moment before responding. "Your apology means nothing without action," she said, crossing her arms. "So let me make this clear. You will face the consequences for this. You don't get to humiliate innocent people, misuse your authority, and then just walk away." Walker exhaled sharply, shoulders slumping. He knew his career was on the line. Williams placed a hand on Angela's shoulder, guiding her slightly away from Walker. "Captain," he said in a quieter voice, "we're taking this to internal affairs. This is not going to be swept under the rug." Angela nodded, but inside, she knew this was only the beginning. As the crowd started murmuring, some stepping forward to show their support, Angela turned toward them. She saw the look in their eyes. Some were relieved she had been able to stand her ground, while others were still seething, anger burning in their gazes. "This isn't just about me," she said, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is about all of us. It's about every person who has been judged unfairly, every person who has been made to feel like they don't belong. This is why we speak up. This is why we hold people accountable." A young man nodded, his phone still recording. "We got your back, Captain," he said firmly. Angela gave him a small nod. But deep inside, she knew this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. As she walked back toward her car, her wrists still stinging from the cuffs, she thought about all the other people who had been in her position, the ones who had been stopped for no reason, humiliated, treated like criminals simply because of the color of their skin. How many of them had not been as lucky? How many had been silenced? Angela wasn't about to let this go. This wasn't just about her. This was about something bigger. She wasn't just going to fight for herself. She was going to fight for all the people who never got the chance to prove their innocence. And she would not be silenced. The shocking revelation. The moments that followed felt like they were suspended in time. The air around Angela was thick with tension as Sergeant Williams led her away from Officer Walker, guiding her back toward the side of the road where her car was parked. Her wrists still ached from the cuffs, and her mind raced with the whirlwind of emotions she had just experienced. As she stood there, trying to gather her thoughts, she couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief. How had it all gone so wrong? How had an afternoon meant for peace and reflection turned into something so horrific, so degrading? But despite the shock still reverberating through her, Angela knew that this moment wasn't about her personal pain. It wasn't even about Officer Walker's disgraceful actions. It was about accountability. It was about shining a light on the ugly truth of systemic bias that permeated so many aspects of law enforcement and society. "I've got your back, Captain," Williams muttered under his breath, his voice full of concern. Angela nodded, grateful for his support, but she couldn't help but notice the discomfort in his eyes. This wasn't something he had expected. Neither of them had. The scene around them was slowly growing more chaotic. More officers had arrived on the scene, all of them looking increasingly uncomfortable as the realization of what had transpired settled in. The bystanders, who had been quietly recording the entire incident, were now speaking to each other in hushed tones, some of them shaking their heads in disbelief. It was then that Angela saw the familiar blue uniforms of two of her colleagues walking toward her. One of them, Officer Jackson, a well-respected detective in her unit, shot her a concerned look. His eyes flicked over her, assessing her condition, before turning to Sergeant Williams. "Captain," Jackson said, his voice low and measured, but with an edge of worry. "Are you all right?" Angela forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll be fine. Just a little shaken." "Shaken?" Officer Jackson echoed, his expression hardening as he turned to Walker. The sight of him, still standing awkwardly off to the side, clearly rattled, only seemed to make Jackson's anger grow. What the hell happened here? "We all know better than this, Trent." Walker, for the first time since the chaos began, looked ashamed. His shoulders were slumped, and his head was lowered. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. He stood there like a man who had realized the full weight of his actions. Actions that could and would define his future. Angela caught her breath. The implications of what had happened were vast, more so than just a personal affront to her. This wasn't just an isolated mistake. This was a reflection of the deeper problem. The problem of racial profiling that had long plagued their system, their profession. This was the moment that could spark real change, or it could be swept under the rug, and she couldn't afford to let that happen. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car door opening. A moment later, a sleek, unmarked black sedan pulled up to the scene. The car door opened, and out stepped Captain Natalie Simmons, the deputy chief of the department, her face set in a look of determination. Angela knew her well. Natalie had been a mentor to her, a woman who had paved the way for other women of color in law enforcement, and who had fought tirelessly to dismantle the biases within the system. "Captain Harris," Natalie greeted her, her voice calm but filled with concern. She took in the scene quickly, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings before settling on Walker, who was still standing there, silent and uncertain. "What happened here?" Natalie's voice was cool, controlled, but there was an undeniable edge to it. Angela sighed, her shoulders sagging as the full weight of the moment hit her. "Officer Walker pulled me over under false pretenses. He accused me of stealing my own car simply because I'm black. He didn't even take the time to check my credentials properly before deciding I was a criminal." Natalie's gaze flicked over to Walker, her eyes narrowing. There was a long, heavy silence before she turned back to Angela. "You're sure of that?" "Absolutely sure," Angela replied, her voice unwavering. "I've given him my license and registration. I told him who I was, and he still made the assumption that I didn't belong in that car." Natalie's expression hardened. "This is unacceptable, Captain. You're right. He violated the department's principles. This is a failure in the system." As she spoke, a quiet murmur of agreement swept through the crowd of officers who had gathered around. It was clear that not everyone in the department was blind to the systemic issues at hand, though they had remained silent for far too long. "What happens now?" Angela asked, her voice calm, but with a note of expectation. Natalie's eyes flicked to Officer Walker, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We will begin an immediate investigation into Officer Walker's actions. Internal affairs will be called in, and I assure you, Captain Harris, this will be taken seriously." "Internal affairs," Walker croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't be serious." Angela turned to him, locking eyes with him for a long moment. "Oh, I'm serious. And I won't let this go. You can't get away with this, Trent. Not this time." Walker looked like a man who had just realized that his entire career was now hanging by a thread. His arrogance had evaporated in the face of truth, replaced by the crushing weight of accountability. His job, his reputation, none of it mattered anymore. He had made a critical error that would follow him for the rest of his life. But Angela wasn't concerned about him. She wasn't concerned about the people who perpetuated this system of bias and prejudice. She was concerned about the people, the black men and women who had been stopped, harassed, or wrongfully accused, with no recourse, no voice. She was fighting for them. "Captain Harris," Natalie said softly, her voice laced with sympathy. "We'll get through this, and we'll make sure that changes happen. This isn't just your battle. This is our fight." The words brought a sense of clarity to Angela, but they didn't erase the anger bubbling beneath the surface. She was grateful for Natalie's support, but this was bigger than just one officer's mistake. This was about an entire system that needed to be overhauled, reshaped, and rebuilt. "Thank you, Natalie," Angela replied, her voice steady. "But I'm not just going to let this go. This is the wake-up call we needed, but it won't be the last. I'll fight for justice for as long as I have to." Walker's future now lay in the hands of internal affairs, and his fate was all but sealed. Angela knew that this wasn't the end, but merely the beginning of something far larger. She felt the strength of that responsibility settle deep in her chest, a weight that would only grow heavier as the story spread, first to the department, then to the public, and eventually nationwide. She took a moment to gather her thoughts, knowing that everything had changed. The story would not only be hers, it would be a story of systemic injustice, of bias, of a reckoning that the department could no longer ignore. As the afternoon sun began to sink lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the pavement, Angela understood that the fight she had just begun wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick, but it was going to be necessary. And she was ready. The price of injustice. The days that followed Angela's wrongful arrest were a whirlwind of emotions and events. The incident had spread like wildfire through the department, igniting deep debates about racial profiling, systemic racism, and accountability. Internal Affairs was swift in launching an investigation, and every day, Angela found herself reliving the humiliation of that afternoon. But through it all, she remained steadfast. The fight had only just begun. The footage of her arrest had gone viral. The world had seen her humiliation in real time. Cuffed on the side of the highway, her dignity stripped away by Officer Walker's assumption of guilt based solely on the color of her skin. The recordings were replayed on social media, news outlets, and forums, sparking outrage not just among the black community, but among people of all backgrounds who recognized the injustice of it all. But while the public outcry was loud, Angela knew that this was more than just a momentary storm. This was a turning point. This was the moment that could change everything, or at the very least, begin the process of change. The media coverage of the incident forced her to confront a hard truth. The power of her platform now had the potential to push this conversation into the spotlight like never before. On the third day following the arrest, Angela was called into a meeting with the department's leadership. Deputy Chief Natalie Simmons had already made it clear that the investigation into Walker would proceed without delay. But this meeting felt like the calm before the storm. It was a chance to address the fallout, to formulate a plan for the department's next steps, and perhaps more importantly, to confront the deeply ingrained issues that had led to this moment. Angela arrived at the department's headquarters early, her thoughts swirling in her mind. The room where the meeting was held was large, with high ceilings and a long conference table at the center. As she entered, she noticed the heavy presence of senior officers who had been part of the department for decades. Some were clearly uncomfortable, while others wore stern faces, unwilling to even look her in the eye. They knew why she was there. Natalie was already seated at the head of the table, and Angela took a seat beside her. The others around the table glanced at each other, a silent tension filling the room. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning, barely cutting through the thick air. "Angela," Natalie began, her voice calm but assertive. "We're here to figure out how we move forward from this, how we make sure something like this never happens again." Angela nodded, but she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. This was her chance, the moment to make her voice heard, to ensure that this wasn't just an isolated incident, but a spark for change. "I appreciate the support," Angela began, her voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. It's about every officer and every citizen who has ever faced this kind of treatment. It's about the culture that allows this kind of thing to happen time and time again, even in a department that claims to serve all citizens equally. We've seen it before, and we'll see it again unless something changes, unless we do something." The silence in the room deepened. Angela's words hung in the air, and it was clear that many of the officers sitting around the table were uncomfortable. They knew she was right. They knew that the department had long struggled with issues of racial bias, both inside the ranks and out on the streets. And yet, for so long, they had ignored it, swept it under the rug, hoping that it would go away. "I don't think anyone here would disagree with you," one of the senior officers, Lieutenant Mark Jensen, spoke up. His voice was low, but his words carried weight. "But the fact is, Angela, that there's a long history here. These biases aren't going to go away overnight. They've been built into this system for years, and now we're dealing with the consequences." Angela nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. She had known that this was going to be a tough conversation, but it was a conversation that needed to be had. "History has a long reach," she said, her voice unwavering. "But that doesn't mean we have to let it dictate our future. We don't have to let these biases shape the way we interact with the communities we're sworn to protect. This department has to change, and that change starts now." There was a murmur of agreement around the table, but Angela could tell that many were still struggling to grasp the full gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about firing one officer. It was about reimagining the entire way the department operated, about creating new training programs, developing better systems for accountability, and fostering a culture of inclusion and respect for all people, regardless of their background. "Angela's right," Natalie spoke up, her voice steady and authoritative. "We have to start by looking inward. We need an independent review of our policies and procedures. We need more training on racial bias and racial profiling. And we need to make sure that every officer understands what it means to serve with integrity, respect, and fairness." The room fell silent as the weight of those words settled in. No one spoke for a long moment, and Angela could feel the collective resistance in the air. The changes that were being proposed were vast, and many of the officers in the room had spent their careers working within the very system that had allowed these issues to persist. Change was never easy, and for those who had benefited from the system, it was even harder to accept. "I know this isn't going to be easy," Angela said, breaking the silence. "But we have a choice. We can either continue with business as usual, ignoring the deep flaws that have been exposed, or we can face the reality of what's going on and take real action to correct it." It was clear that the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but Angela knew that this was her calling, her mission, not just to correct the wrong that had been done to her, but to ensure that this injustice would not be visited upon anyone else. As the meeting continued, plans for an internal review were put in motion. Officer Walker, despite his earlier protests, was placed on immediate administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation. A team of external consultants, specializing in racial bias and law enforcement reform, was hired to evaluate the department's practices and provide recommendations for improvement. But even as the department began to move forward, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much bigger battle. The media had not let up. News stories about her arrest continued to flood the airwaves, fueling the conversation about racial profiling and police reform. Angela had become a symbol of resistance, not just in her department, but in the broader conversation about policing in America. While she was grateful for the support of her colleagues, she knew that the fight was far from over. The real work, the difficult work, would take years, if not decades. But that didn't matter. She had already made a choice. Angela wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been judged by the color of their skin, for everyone who had ever been silenced by fear, for every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. And she wasn't backing down. As she left the meeting that day, the weight of the decisions made hung heavy on her shoulders. She knew there was much to be done. But with each passing moment, with each step she took toward creating meaningful change, Angela could feel the fire inside her burning brighter, and she was ready to carry it.